Hi everyone, I hope you're all well this week. I'm here today to speak to you about police discretion for HSP108. As you can see on this first slide here, police discretion is something that's fairly controversial. There's a lot of debate about what discretion is, most importantly, and how police use discretion in their everyday practice. So I'm just going to take you through a few of the key issues that come into play when we talk about this notion of police discretion. It's quite a heavy lecture. So I'm also going to talk you through a little example in a second mini lecture for today. But hopefully by the end of this lecture, you'll get an understanding of what police discretion is and how it functions. And quite frankly, that will be enough because this is extremely complex. You might remember a couple of the slides that I'm talking about this week being in other lectures because it links in so well with so many different parts of what police do as policing work. So why is police discretion important? Peter Neyroud, I hope I've got that right, talks about the different, what he calls the crises of policing ethics in particular, and it talks about how historically there's been quite a number of major ethical crises in policing, motivated typically by different types of policing instances. And professionalism is definitely at the top of the list. Covert policing is another one. Corruption is another one. But discretion is there at number 2. And I like this little cartoon, this sort of Monopoly cartoon that demonstrates police discretion quite well. So on the one hand, we've got the police officer, thinking, oh, do I arrest this person or do I give them the get out of jail free card, so to speak? Give them a warning and let them go. Because this is effectively what discretion involves, which is why it's such a controversial thing. There will always be moments where people will say, how come police didn't use their discretion in this particular instance and just let the person go? So this is where it gets a little bit muddy, and why discretion, I think, is most important, because police have the discretionary power to either direct an offender into or away from further contact particularly, with the criminal justice system. Now, we have substantial research that tells us that any contact at all with the criminal justice system beyond police is very, very likely to mean that those people continue to come back to our criminal justice systems over time, and that they become entrenched in those systems. And those systems cost us a lot of money. So the more that we can direct people away from criminal justice systems, the more likely we are to stop people from reoffending in the future. It's a pretty important decision then that police make, whether or not they choose to charge or whether or not they choose to let somebody go. So, of course, they can decide to caution, issue a summons, arrest, charge an offender, and so forth. Now, you've probably seen this little cartoon that I've got already as well on this particular slide. It's got a picture of a whole bunch of revellers in suits holding their wine glasses and things like that. And then we've got, on the left-hand side, we've got a homeless person, and we've got the police officer standing there, and he's between these two groups. Now, the issue, of course, is at sort of up for discussion in this cartoon is drinking in public spaces. And the people with the suits who are drinking wine are obviously being overlooked in this particular instance by police. And the person who is homeless is being charged under the public nuisance laws. Now, although this seems to be, some might read this as a biased image of police and the type of police work that they do, this is very, honestly, it's a very common thing to happen where, for instance, some of the young people that I speak to will say, well, there were people over there drinking stubbies, but they were well dressed and they were adults. and they obviously got overlooked, but they came straight over to us and told us to, leave the area and tipped all of our alcohol out and so on and so forth. So it's actually quite a common experience, and why we need to talk about and understand what discretion actually means in day-to-day life for police officers. I love this particular quote by Schulenberg that says, when the police lay a charge, they publicly define what kind of youth problems, in this case, are official and what kind are absorbed back into the community. And that could be any range of different types of problems. You could put mental health problems, you could put disorder problems, whatever. Any type of problems, not just youth problems, could fit into that particular quote. And I do believe that person in the picture may be some sort of celebrity. I'm not sure. But in this instance, police are defining his behaviour as a problem, and he doesn't look particularly pleased about it. So what is police discretion? It's something that's governed by formal laws and policies overall in the general work that police do every day, but those overall policies, laws, etc. are things that police have decision-making powers about. So those formal laws and policies are tempered by the exercise of discretion by police officers at all levels of policing services. Discretion is the freedom, power, authority, decision or leeway of an official, organisation or individual to decide, discern or determine to make a judgment, choice or decision about alternate courses of action. It's quite a complex definition, but I actually really love this particular one. I think it might be by Lorraine Gelsthorpe. This quote clearly demonstrates the interlocking of a whole range of different types of things at once that are involved in discretion on an everyday basis. So discretion is one of those police powers that they have. This power is limited in law, but unfortunately is not usually limited in action. So at the same time, though, it's a bit of a myth to say that police do the work of full enforcement of the criminal law. Like, it's not even possible to do that. Police discretion applies to a whole range of different areas. They choose objectives, they choose methods of intervention, they choose how to dispose of cases as well. Do they go to a conference or do they go to court, for instance? They choose investigative measures, they choose field procedures, and of course they issue permits and licenses. So each of these things requires police discretion, and each of these things moderate this notion of, or the idea or myth, that police work to fully enforce the criminal law, because it's not the case. They have a lot of discretion and decision-making powers within those formal legal parameters. So this is a nice little diagram that really demonstrates this quite well. It demonstrates the power that, they decide whether to investigate, how to conduct the investigation, whether to arrest a person, whether to actually charge, and what charges they're actually going to be. It's a really fantastic little diagram that perfectly summarises what we're talking about. There are influences around police discretion, of course, and we have already touched on this a little bit, so I won't go into the stuff that I've got a little bit further down in huge detail, but there are some key things which influence police discretion. Number one is process. Police practitioners have been provided with the ability to screen out or divert cases from the criminal justice system based on legal or practical considerations. So if a young person's been pulled up and has been found to have a Sharpie in their pocket, yet they've already received a fine that day for having a Sharpie in their pocket, then clearly the police officer's probably not going to give them a fine. So they've been given the ability to screen out that particular issue and divert that case from the criminal justice system in the first instance. It's also very much shaped by the environment. The actions undertaken by police practitioners will often be influenced by community views concerning appropriate courses of action. So if there's a person standing in a strip mall, a shopping mall, for example, and they are yelling loudly, walking with their pants around their ankles, just as a really random example, there's a really good chance that the police will act fairly swiftly to try and get the person to pull up their pants and to stop yelling loudly in a public place. If this was happening if we take that environment away, the shopping mall away, and we put that environment in a person's front yard, the neighbours will probably at some point call the police, and they might turn up and instead try and get that person to come inside the house and work through the reasons why they're demonstrating that behaviour and all of those types of things, like, can I call somebody to help you through this time, or whatever it might be. So the environment matters in how discretion happens. Context also matters, and this can be influenced by internal organisational contexts as well as occupational factors that are happening. So internal contexts might be that the police organisation makes a decision at the top that all police need to be giving fines to people who drop cigarette butts on the ground, right? So that means that they have to do that. They have no discretion in that decision whatsoever. Occupational factors might be that they know that they've got 10 other charges waiting for them back at the station. They decide to let those 3 charges over there that they can clearly see happening, they decide to let them go because they've just got too much work in what's going in those what's going on in that particular day. And of course, that decision will also be influenced by the seriousness of it and all of those types of things. Illicit considerations also come into play, and these are often related to something that we call unconscious bias, things that don't necessarily, we're not necessarily aware that they shape our behaviour, but they do in certain ways. So factors such as class, race, gender, and so forth underpin a professional's actions in everyday working environments, and that's no different for police. Why is discretion necessary? There's a few key things that talk about this. Number 1, legislation is not always right, and it will never be perfect. So no legislature has ever succeeded in formulating laws which encompass all conduct intended to be made criminal and clearly exclude all other conduct. It's not a perfect system. So police have to have the capacity to make decisions about saying no to some things and yes to charging others. Number 2, the failure to eliminate poorly drafted and obsolete legislation is something that does actually hang around. There is legislation in some states which is completely absurd. For instance, in Queensland, it's illegal to stand in front of an automatic teller machine, an ATM, wearing fluffy slippers and a wig. I don't know why. I don't even know if I want to know why about that particular legislation, but that's clearly legislation, perhaps not necessarily logical, and perhaps also obsolete, but apparently that's a thing in Queensland. So in order to make things fair, police work through the notion that, well, if you're a tour operator and you have a license to be in that area at the time, then we are not going to work on the basis that we need to fine you for parking your horse and cart in this area because that legislation has been in place since 1800s. And yes, that is also something that has been a common issue, not hugely common, but it's something that has been raised in the past. So they need discretion in order to ensure that fairness and contemporary contexts are taken into consideration around legislative framework. Discretion is also necessary because limited resources make it impossible to enforce all law against all offenders. Sometimes when you talk about police officers, they'll talk about how they're walking around in public spaces even when they're off duty, and they'll just see there's that person over there doing that wrong thing. I can see that person's doing something illegal. Oh, look at that over there. That's another charge. They just have to turn a blind eye. They can't be doing that stuff all of the time. So the resources will help guide the ways in which police the limited police resources they have are targeted towards particular types of crimes and so forth, which are worth, following up in the public best interest to follow up, I suppose, overall. And of course, most importantly, the strict enforcement of the law would have harsh and intolerable results. And we can see this quite often demonstrated in other contexts. Again, you'll hear me bang on about America a lot because, quite frankly, it's a fabulous example of what's wrong a lot with policing. But America is a good example. There are a couple of jurisdictions where they have strict zero tolerance policing programs in place, and it does have quite considerable intolerable results. One of the examples that I demonstrated last week when we talked about stop and search powers in New York City, perfect example of what we are talking about in this point. So I guess you're getting the sense now that discretion can be positive and negative, not necessarily either one or the other, or more of one or the other. It provides a mechanism to show mercy, which, even if defying precise definition, many would recognise as being a necessary in the conception and delivery of justice. It also has a negative side when it leads to unjustifiable decisions, negative discrimination, and, of course, inconsistency. So disparity between different types of processes. Again, what we talked about last week with the stop and search shows very perfectly these negative notions in play. So unjustifiable decisions where, most of the black community is being stopped and searched by police, yet the white community clearly aren't. And this is very obvious when they are being pulled up for precisely the same behaviour but white people are engaged in, but police just let the white people go and they charge the black people. It's it's unconscionable, really. And of course, we can see the inconsistency and the disparity with the huge numbers of black people, even though they make a very small proportion of that overall population, and the hugely small numbers of white people, yet they make up the majority of that population. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about disparity. We can see this happening in a range of different areas, not just America, but it's the one that I know most about. So I do apologise if you're feeling a tad peeved by my constant talking about America. It's just a very good example. So police have discretion at all levels. It's mandated flexibility, but they do not possess complete freedom as to how they exercise it. So they have to consider all of those factors that we just talked about in terms of whether or not it's appropriate to exercise discretion. So they've got cautions, warnings, arrests, charges, remands, all of these different types of things that they can go through in order to choose whether or not someone goes into the system at any one point in time. They have judgments or choices which are in practice much constrained, but they're not only by formal rules but also by the many social, economic, political constraints that act upon the exercise of choice. So there's a whole range of different factors which are informing this notion of discretion. And of course, I wanted to make this point again, that it is actually impossible to enforce every law, and thus a choice has to be made about what the most important situation is that a law enforcement officer will act upon in a certain circumstance. So for instance, if we take the example of the London terrorist situation that happened recently right near Westminster, where a person, ran over a whole bunch of people and then proceeded to stab a police officer. If we take that as an example, then, for instance, if that was happening and there were police everywhere and there was a whole bunch of people over here who were snatching bags from people, they're going to totally ignore the snatching bags and they're totally going to focus on the lives of those people who are being run over by a lunatic. So, excuse the word lunatic, but that's generally the way that they will think about that situation. They're like, they have to respond to the more serious thing that's happening rather than the people in the park who are losing their bags. So it's very, very important that they think through those processes very carefully. The key problem, of course, with that situation is that decisions could be based sometimes on the personal views and prejudices of even the most senior officers. But we'll talk about that over coming weeks in a little bit more detail. So, street level discretion is a key issue that has been raised in a lot of research because people argue that junior officers have to make some pretty significant decisions about whether or not to make charges and what should be and shouldn't be considered a crime, depending on what is going on. They're required to exercise their judgment as to whether the law is being broken and if so, what action that they need to take. And often these discretionary decisions are made on the spur of the moment. They have sometimes seconds to make a decision about whether or not to act on something or whether or not to let it go or how they are going to act. So they've decided they're going to act on something, they need to decide how to act in that particular instance. So all of these things involve discretion by police. What to charge the suspect with, whether or not to release them on bail or remand them in custody, whether or not to send them off to a conference as opposed to sending them off to court. We've already talked through the different factors influencing police discretion, the personal ones, learned attitudes and beliefs, entrenched assumptions and prejudices, negative views or perspectives of others, and the notion of generalisation. And I believe I spoke about an example involving an Indian taxi driver in that particular instance. We've also spoken about the professional and situational factors that influence police discretion. All of these things will drive how police do their everyday work. And the ways in which, for instance, management policies might influence whether or not there's more restriction around specific targeting of hotspot areas and so forth, and the types of tactics that need to be undertaken within that certain type of hotspot. So we've talked, I think, quite a bit about these factors already. Often something that is raised as an issue is the lack of administrative discretion. So, for instance, a few officers mentioned that while there was no formal quota, they were expected to write about 10 tickets a day to satisfy the administration. So this is just something that's been raised in some qualitative research with police officers, I believe, in the United States. And a lot of officers really don't like it when they don't have the capacity to have broad discretion. And administrative discretion often influences the ways that they think about this. So they genuinely may hate the fact that they don't have a lot of discretion, and they feel a lot of discontent with the organisation for imposing those types of fixtures upon what they do in their everyday work. Of course, we've already touched on discriminatory practices and the notions around how police discretion really influences this. And this is very well summed up in this particular quote from Philip Stenning. Of great concern in many jurisdictions in recent years has been allegations of discriminatory exercises of discretion by officers against members of particular groups. So racial, ethnic minorities, youth, members of religious groups, gays and lesbians, low income and homeless people, etc. And there are a lot of different groups, even people with intellectual disabilities and mental health issues, all of those types of things. Sociologists of police have long observed how police, in doing their patrolling and investigative work, often seem to focus disproportionately on the activities of those who they perceive to be the usual suspects, who frequently belong to such groups. Now, not everyone is involved in these groups. In fact, it's probably the minority. If we take young people for an example again, because that's related to my own research, it's very much the minority of young people who are involved in these types of groups, and most importantly, who are visible in public spaces a lot. But it is very clear that police don't use a lot of discretion in their everyday dealings with young people. And I often wonder if it's not because they feel like they shouldn't use it, but that they can't, because these interactions often happen in public spaces and they are in full view of thousands of people, milling around them, watching them. They need to be seen to be doing something about those young people hanging out in public spaces. And of course, the classic example of that is the shop owner giving the police a call saying these young people are sitting outside, they're wearing black, they look really menacing, or alternatively, they're being really loud and obnoxious and swearing and none of the customers are coming in. Police have to act on that. They need to do something about it. But that means that these young people who often have nowhere else to go, it's not just because they're hanging out there because it's a kind of cool place to go. That's, again, the minority of young people. The majority of young people will be there because they have nowhere else to go. They don't want to go home for whatever reason. These are the young people who are negatively impacted by police discretion on an everyday basis. Because police choose to give them a fine for whatever reason, they don't have capacity to pay, they're estranged from their parents, they don't have a lot of support. All of these influences mean that police discretion and charging that young person is a discriminatory process. And police really need to be cognizant of those issues when they're thinking about that in their everyday practice. So another little quote here. While an officer works with little supervision or in low visibility situations, an officer must act in a manner that is just and proper under the circumstances, using the options that are available and lawful. So, regardless of what the circumstance is, whether or not they are visible in public or whether or not it's somewhere else where they're not so visible in public, they need to ensure that they're delivering the same service across those two different areas, and that everything that they're using is available and that it's lawful in accordance with legislative frameworks. So, although we have a little bit of research about police discretion, I'd like to end the point that we really do need to do a lot more research about what police discretion looks like, how police actually do discretion, the ways in which they make decisions around discretion, and what the influencing factors are. We have a little bit of research, but it's fairly dated now, and I think we need to update that quite a bit because we have all of these new technologies and so forth which can influence the way that police discretion happens. So we really need to know more about what police actually do when they make decisions about a particular person in a particular circumstance. It's that simple. There are also many factors that influence police discretion, and these are often very difficult to train police about. It's really hard to be able to say, well, next week you're going to be in this situation where you need to make a decision about this person with mental health issues and you need to decide how that's going to pan out, right? It's almost impossible to give police officers guidance around how to do those processes before they've come into contact with them. So that's another really key question that I think into the future when it comes to discretion that we need to consider further. Anyway, I hope that gives you a good understanding of what those issues are. Thanks for listening, and I shall speak with you all very soon. See ya!